Live from the Clarity from Chaos studios, heard worldwide, it's Dave Campbell. On every episode, Dave and his guests explore, discuss, and work on solutions to some of life's biggest challenges. So, if you're ready, be prepared to be enlightened, amused, and even shocked by what you hear. And now, the real, the authentic, the one and only Dave Campbell.
Welcome to Clarity from Chaos. I'm your host, Dave Campbell. We are incredibly pleased to welcome the president of the Mises Institute and former professor of economics at Loyola University, Dr. Thomas DiLorenzo. Dr. DiLorenzo is the author or co-author of 18 books, including The Real Lincoln, How Capitalism Saved America, and The Politically Incorrect Guide to Economics, just to name a few. He is also part of the highly acclaimed documentary, Playing with Fire, Money, Banking, and the Federal Reserve. Welcome to the show.
Pleased to be with you.
So let's start for the audience to give a little bit of background to the Federal Reserve, Tom, because I think people are under the normal impression that the Fed is part of the government. I don't think they really understand that it's a standalone institution.
Well, it's not 100% standalone because the chairman of the Fed is appointed by the president. So
Right.
It's sort of a hybrid. It's part politics and part private. The owners are banks, national banks who own stock in it. So it's a private corporation, really, but it's run by politicians. The chairman of the Fed it has a board of governors, which is like a board of trustees, board of directors, and they're also appointed by the president. And so it's a kind of a weird thing. Usually when corporations get together and conspire to use the government to benefit them at the expense of us, they don't do it this way. They usually set up some sort of regulatory agency with a group of other people, and they pass regulations prohibiting price cutting and things like that. That was, for example, the Interstate Commerce Commission was the very first federal regulatory agency, and it was run, the first head of it was a railroad industry president, and it was supposed to regulate the railroads in the public interest. One of the first things he did was to outlaw price cutting. And the Fed is a similar, but it's just set up differently. It's the bankers are the ones who are the main beneficiaries, but they use the power of government to eliminate competition, basically. And the way in which they do it is when the Fed was created in 1913, there are a lot of banks that wanted to be able to lend money without having sufficient reserves of gold and silver, so that if people decided they didn't want their money, they didn't want to use their money, their currency, they could go to the bank and trade it in for gold and silver.
Right.
But a lot of banks didn't have enough gold and silver, but they wanted to lend money anyway. And so that restricted their ability to make loans and make money. And they wanted the government to come in and be what they called a lender of last resort, which is another way of saying if there's a bank run and you're about to go bankrupt, we will bail you out. And so that's what the Fed basically does. It's a legalized counterfeiting operation. It creates money out of thin air. If you and I were to do that, we would go to prison for a very long time. They would make us live in a cage like a dog for many years. And when the government does it, if you call it monetary policy, it's okay. So if you're thinking of setting up a printing press in your basement, for example, just call it monetary policy and it'll be good.
There you go.
There'll be no risk to you in going to jail.
Yep.
But, and so with the Fed, all the banks can lend as much as they want. And the Fed for a while had what's called a reserve requirement. A percentage of your deposits had to be held in reserve to deter in case there's a bank run, in case too many people come in and want their money out of your bank. And historically, it's been 10%, 5%, 3%. As of last year, it is 0%. And so you don't have to have $1 in reserve anymore. And that's because, as we saw in 2008, when some of the bigger politically connected banks like Goldman Sachs lost a lot of money, they were bailed out by the Fed and the U.S. Treasury, for that matter.
But
80,
I bet
90,
they were bailed out by
$100
us, though, right, Tom?
Yeah.
I mean,
Sure.
we bailed them out.
Oh, sure. When the Fed does that, when the Fed prints that money, it creates price inflation among other things. And the Fed's policy is they say we always want to have at least 2% inflation. under the theory that the Great Depression, for much of the Great Depression, there was price deflation, and we can't have that. And that's baloney. There was price deflation the whole period from the end of the Civil War, 1865, until the turn of the 20th century was a period of deflation because that was the Industrial Revolution in America, and there was tremendous increase in production and supply. And so the increase in supply pushed prices of just about everything down, and that was great. And so now we have the Fed that says, oh, no, you can never have a price cut. But with all the technology we've got, with artificial intelligence now and everything else, prices should be going down everywhere of just about everything. The only reason they're not is that the Fed keeps putting so much money in circulation. And of course, the Fed is the politicians' favorite institution because if they had to raise taxes to pay for all these things that they want to do, import 30 million illegal aliens and put them all on welfare. How about if the government said, that's what we're going to do, but to finance it, every working family is going to be sent a tax bill for $50,000 to pay for it all. I bet there'd be a lot less support for importing 30 million illegal aliens.
A hell of a lot less support.
Yes. Or anything else the government does.
Oh, exactly.
The war in Ukraine, the war in Israel,
anything. Anything. Well, it's precisely the curiosity here is you and I have to run our household accounts that way. We can't. I guess some people can, but most people don't literally go out and start, buying on credit. There is the, you can go bankrupt and so on and so forth. But most
for
people
decades at a time, like the government does.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, most people are fairly prudent or try to be fairly prudent with their financials. The government, to your point, they want to do something, they just fire up a printing press and get after it.
Yeah.
Which brings me to a question, though, Tom. Why the Fed? Because doesn't the Department of the Treasury Department, if you will, isn't there charter to coin money? And so I'm kind of confused on why the Fed, because obviously they put the Fed together in secret. Why the Fed, other than to create this financial control and whatnot? Basically, they're a cartel, if you will. Why can't we just do away with them? Because we have the Department of Treasury that is chartered, aren't they, to handle the economy and such?
Well, the Constitution gives the government the ability to coin money.
Right.
It does not give it the ability to print paper money, but it does anyway. The government has been ignoring the entire Constitution for generations now. It's pretty much useless as if the Constitution was a constraint on government, how on earth would we be where we are today?
Yeah.
Where the government spends money on anything and everything under the planet, sex change operations. I remember 25 years ago, we were laughing at that, but here we are now. The government's
exactly.
financing sex change operations, which is another word for bodily mutilation. And so, the Fed disguises the cost of government. That's the thing. Like I said earlier, if the government had to raise taxes to pay for all these things, we would have a lot less government. Even Adam Smith, the famous book, The Wealth of Nations, considered to be one of the very first economic treatises. 1776, it was published, the year of the Declaration of Independence. Adam Smith himself said that if the government had to finance wars with taxation, there'd be fewer wars, and the wars that existed would be shorter. It wouldn't be last as long.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's true of everything, not just wars, but everything the government finances. That would be true of it. And not to say we shouldn't have any borrowing. When the government, if we're going to build a sewer system, issuing bonds is a reasonable idea because you're going to benefit from the new sewer system for the next 30 years. So it spreads out the cost of something like that. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about current expenditures. We're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars spending on welfare and everything else that is spent today, not infrastructure. That's a relatively smart or small part of what government does nowadays. And so the Fed it creates what economists call fiscal illusion. It makes us think that government is cheaper than it really is, that the cost of government is cheaper. And of course, the politicians love that because it allows them to play Santa Claus. They can buy votes legally. By building new dormitories at your local university, building and hiring 1,000 people to do it. and those people know who to thank for the job they get
Well,
building
yeah,
a
and
dormitory.
that's the fight that's going on now, right, Tom? Is with
Yes.
Doge and everything else, is they're starting to pull the blankets back and seeing where some of this crap is going. And I mean, even the other day, there's a photograph, and I don't know the validity of this, but one of the Obama daughters had been given $2.5 million by the USAID to do consulting work, for Christ's sake.
Yeah. Consulting. She's still in college, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, I read that Chelsea Clinton started up some kind of phony baloney nonprofit along the lines of her parents and was given $60 million from the government.
Right.
But what has Chelsea Clinton ever done to deserve $60 million from anybody or for anything?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah. But what worries me, though, is what we're talking about here should have the hairs on everybody's neck up, and they should be storming Washington with pitchforks, and they don't seem to. And I can't quite put my finger on why, because it seems it's so obvious, right? Some of the things that we're talking about, even to the person that doesn't even read about this stuff or anything else, it just smacks of corruption. But there doesn't seem to be the outroar about it,
Yeah. Well, people did vote President Trump in. That was a big thing.
Yeah.
So the people did put their trust in that.
Right.
But most people, I was an economics professor for many years, and there's a part of the economics literature, there's a phrase called rational ignorance. It says that your average person spends most of their time educating themselves on how to get through school, how to get a job, how to do the job, how to raise your family, how to get the bills paid. And we spend relatively little time on politics and government and all that. And a lot of what we do know about politics and government is lies and propaganda spread by the government and its media puppets, the so-called mainstream media. And so that's where we are today, I think. And government is so big and gargantuan that it's impossible for any human brain to understand more than a tiny, tiny percentage of 1% of what it does. But, good thing that Elon Musk has done is, bring some of this out in the open and show people how outrageous the theft is. And, Washington, D.C. is one big crime scene. And we got a lot of evidence of that from Elon Musk and the Doge.
Absolutely. But the problem is, if they don't codify it, Tom, then it was just a waste of time, right? And
the Republicans just today, I read that they gave us the biggest military budget in human history, and so they're not interested in cutting anything, especially when it comes to the military.
Oh no!
It's like we're at war with all the rest of the world all of a sudden. There's too much money they want to spend on the military.
Yeah, exactly.
And of course, that means giving money to defense contractors to then finance the careers of these used car salesmen who are in Congress. And that's really what they're talking about.
Right. So let's shift gears a little bit and let's talk about the documentary. Yeah, I'm about halfway through for the second time the Creature from Jekyll Island, which I highly recommend if anybody's just bored and they want to read about the Fed, because it definitely puts your hair up, as far as what's going on. But talk about the documentary.
It's called Playing with Fire, Money, Banking, and the Federal Reserve, done by the Mises Institute. We hired a professional production company. Ron Paul is in it. I'm in it, James Grant, and some of our academics. And it's a 38-minute documentary. It's an attempt to explain in plain English what the Fed does and what the Fed is about, because it's always been purposely confusing so that the average American can't understand what the heck is going on, what it does. We know we have this Wizard of Oz character, Jerome Powell, the chairman of the Fed.
I was going to get to that. Yeah.
Every couple of weeks, it seems, the whole world is sitting on edge, waiting for the wizard to pull the curtain behind and make a 5-second announcement about interest rates, and then he shuts the curtain again for the next couple of months.
Yep.
And the Soviets never had such central planning power as one man, making influence the whole world, not just the United States, as far as the markets are concerned. And so it really is sort of a socialist central planning agency. And we just talk about this in the video. The title comes from James Grant, who's the well-known Wall Street bond trader, written many books over the years, big advocate of the gold standard. And he said the Fed is kind of like an arsonist that sets a house on fire. And then once the fire is going, the arsonist changes clothes and dresses up as a firefighter and pretends to be putting the fire out by pouring more gasoline on the flames. That's
Right.
basically what the Fed does, because it creates boom and bust cycles like the crash of 2008, and it responds with more of the same, printing more money, creating another bubble.
Right.
And so that you'll have the crash of 2018 or whatever,
Yep.
another crash. That's all the Fed knows how to do, is counterfeit money, which creates bubbles somewhere. Sometimes it's the stock market, sometimes it's the housing market. Today, there's a big bubble in the car market, the college tuition market, the
Right.
stock market. No one can predict when these bubbles are going to burst, but they will. They always do eventually, and that's what the Fed basically does. So our documentary is aimed at the average citizen who's curious and wants to start educating themselves about this. And once you start doing that, you can follow up on your own. You can check out our website, Mises.org, and you can get a great free education about this and a lot of other topics if you're so
Right.
inclined.
No, absolutely. So why don't, because if memory serves, Ron Paul was a proponent of doing away with the Fed. Well, he was after auditing them,
Yes.
which it's very much a Doge-like activity.
Yes.
But I'm not quite well, other than the fact that they're running interference for the politicians. Why? Because Trump has been a pretty disruptive organism so far. I'm just wondering if it could get pushed a little bit further, right? I know he's unhappy with Powell, but they seem to be crawfishing back and forth about dumping him and bringing somebody else in.
Yeah, well, I don't think it's possible to do that. He just has to wait for another year or so until Powell's term is up. But President Trump is even worse than Jerome Powell. His position is that the Fed should be printing even more money because he thinks that'll drop interest rates. President Trump is an old real estate developer, and he'd be happy if we had zero interest rates. And of course, that is a total distortion of credit markets. Look at what that does to retired people. It's like a war on retired people,
Right.
who either you earn 0.5% in a savings account before taxes, or you take a big risk in losing everything and invest in the stock market. And it's not possible to get more than a couple of percentage points in interest anymore these days because of that. And President Trump, being a real estate developer, thinks it'd be great. Look at all the money the real estate developers would make. But people who's saving for their retirement and are living on fixed incomes are screwed by the whole thing. And so he doesn't understand that it's ridiculous to put a politician or a political appointee in charge of setting the price of anything. We need to let, if it's good for that, why aren't we having the government set the price of cars and groceries and everything else,
I
just
think
like
that-
they did in the Soviet Union?
Yeah,
And all
exactly.
the other communist country, communist China. That's the sort of the communist China model of markets.
Yeah, and I hate to say it, but I think that's embraced in a lot of circles because of some of the stuff that I've read. The Fed was one of the driving vehicles pulled together to help promote socialism.
Yeah.
So it wouldn't surprise me, and we've seen it over the last 4 years with whatever you want to call Biden's presidency of the socialistic push, which has been ongoing since FD.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. We've become more and more socialist over the past 75 years.
Right.
With government, taxes alone taking up about federal, state, and local taxes, almost 40% of national income. And then government regulation is a tax because
Right.
every industry that is regulated, it causes the price of the product to go up. Look at all the car regulation. A big component of why cars are so expensive is government regulation. It costs a lot of money to change the way you make cars to satisfy the government bureaucrats.
Exactly.
And so we pay the price for that. And so we're more than 50% socialist. And the Fed, since it finances everything government does to some extent, has been a key component of that. And war too. The Fed was created in 1913, and it financed about 40% of our entry into World War I, which had nothing to do with Americans.
Right.
All we did was, a couple 100,000 Americans died and even more than that number were maimed for life in World War I for nothing. Had nothing whatsoever to do with us. It was a European dispute, and
Right.
but the Fed allowed that to happen. If it weren't for the Fed, we never would have been able to do that. And the same with all the other military adventures around the world that really have nothing to do with protecting anyone or anything in America. It's just mostly about making money for the defense contracting industry and the politicians who get
Right.
the kickbacks from.
Oh, absolutely. It's but people would scream isolationism, Tom, and all of this stuff. But the stop of the interesting thing, like what we've been talking about, we have to stop communism. Well, you don't have to look too far in your own country for this communistic idea to get stopped. I mean, you hear it
Yeah,
every day spouted by our own congressmen and
yeah.
women.
Go to any university.
Or go to any university and you can readily hear it, right?
Yeah, that's
And
that's right.
so we've got to go out, and we keep claiming that Russia's the monster, China's the monster, but
Yeah.
it's just kabuki theater.
Yeah, it's all a big lie. By the way, the Mises Institute is having a conference on the topic of revisionist history of war, May 15th through 17th in Auburn, Alabama, where we're located. And we have a great cast of speakers who are going to address all sorts of government lies about war. During that, you can check our website and go click on events at the top of the page.
Right.
That's Mises.org, and you can see the schedule for that. And yeah, the war crowd. It's always all about making money. Follow the money.
Sure.
And see what all this is about. And even we were told that when I was young that if we lost the Vietnam War, communism would spread all over the world.
Precisely.
Well, we did lose the Vietnam War, and communism did not spread all around the world.
No.
So that is proof positive that was a lie,
Right.
concocted by the CIA to justify another useless war that had nothing to do with us.
Exactly.
We were never threatened with being forced to speak Vietnamese or Chinese or anything else like that.
No.
Or Iraqi, for that matter.
No. It's interesting the way things get manipulated. So with that said, what are your thoughts on Trump to date? I mean, we just finished the first 100 days. He's trying to rebuild trade in this country and everything else with tariffs and whatnot. So what are your thoughts?
The tariff issue, his theory is dead wrong because it's based on he and his advisors apparently think that the trade deficit between our country and other countries is caused by the fact that his predecessors in the White House were not as good negotiators as he is. But consider this. When President Trump was president the first time, he changed NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. They adopted a new one, and this was his work. And the result of that was zero tariffs between Canada, Mexico, and the United States, and zero non-tariff barriers to trade, like quotas. We have had quotas on Japanese cars in the past, for example. And so Canada, U.S., and Mexico agreed no tariffs and no non-tariff barriers to trade. So we had totally free trade among these three countries, but we still had, as of, I think, 2 years ago, a $69 billion trade deficit with Canada and Mexico. And so if tariffs on our products are the cause of these trade deficits, it can't be true that trade deficit is caused by tariffs because there were no tariffs.
Right.
The same is true of South Korea. South Korea has no tariffs on American imports, but we have a big trade deficit with South Korea. And the main reason is that our wages are much higher than some of these other countries. I think if you compare like wages in manufacturing in the U.S. and Mexico, ours are 6 or 7 times higher than Mexico. And the Fed has a lot to do with that. The Fed creates price inflation year after year after year. And to compete for employees, companies need to give you at least a cost of living increase to keep you working there, or else you're getting a pay cut in real dollars. And over the years, that fuels a good part of this difference in production costs between America and the rest of the world. And so I think his whole thing about raising tariffs, or what he's doing with tariffs, is based on a falsehood that the cause of trade imbalances is that nobody is as good a negotiator as Donald Trump. All the other presidents in history, he's the best. As you know, he claims he's the best ever at everything. Even when he took his physical the first time around, the doctor said he's the healthiest presidential candidate in history because the doctor, being a toady, knew that that's exactly what Donald Trump himself would say about his own health while he was running for president. So, which is hard to believe. There's never been a healthier president. There have been some that are much younger than him. And I'm sure you could find at least one that was healthier than him coming into
Well,
the office.
I think Teddy Roosevelt was probably pretty healthy. I mean, he stood up and gave a speech with a gunshot wound in his chest.
Yeah,
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 he was pretty healthy.
yeah, yeah.
I would like to touch on one thing this kind of struck my interest, and that's the ongoing BRICS movement with China on the currency of changing the currency issues and paralleling, I guess, the U.S. dollar being the currency of choice, right? And I was curious your thoughts on that and where that may or may not go.
Well, I'm not a fortune teller. I'm not sure what and I'm not a insider, so I don't know what's
Right.
going on, what these people are talking about. But one thing about that is that the fact that the dollar is a reserve currency, that
Mm-hmm.
governments all over the world hold massive amounts of dollars for that reason, and individuals, that our government uses that as a political weapon. Do as we say, or we will freeze your assets. There are hundreds of institutions, including entire governments, that are under that
Threat.
gun of
Right.
freezing your dollar assets.
Right.
It's a way of getting what we want. It's a way of enforcing the foreign policy that was enunciated in a bumper sticker I once saw. It had a little American flag in the corner, and it said, "Do as we say, or we will bring democracy to your country." Democracy means bringing the U.S. military and forcing you to do as we say.
Exactly.
And we don't need to do that if we can engage in economic blackmail instead. We can force them to do as we say without firing a shot, because the dollar is reserve currency. So even if we did lose out and the dollar was no longer the reserve currency, there's at least that benefit to it. We'd no longer be able to bully all the rest of the world from our foreign policy perspective, and that would be a good thing.
Yeah, I would agree. It caught my eye. It hasn't been publicized much. People haven't talked about it very much. And I was doing some reading today about it, and I found it kind of fascinating. And, I wanted your thoughts on it. So where do you think, I know you mentioned you don't have a crystal ball, so this isn't fair, but what are your future concerns of where we're at right now?
Well, the spending is not falling, despite what Elon Musk has done. It's a colleague of mine called it a Doge and Pony show. Get it? Dog and Pony show, Doge and Pony show.
Sure.
Because just today I was reading they reduced the estimate of how much money he claims to save, which is 150 billion, which is peanuts. And as you said earlier, the Congress has to vote on that. They have to say, okay, we're going to get rid of this. And they haven't done that.
Nope, they have not.
And at the same time, they did vote on a massive increase in military spending. And so that's all going to come out of the pockets of you and me and everybody else who pays taxes and lives in America and has to suffer through more inflation, more price inflation because of the Fed money printing to pay for all this military expansionism.
Right.
And President Trump promised to be a peace candidate. And the first thing he did was to decide to send more bombs and more fighter jets to Israel and Ukraine in the wars that we're involved in there, which again have nothing whatsoever to do with protecting anyone or anything in America.
No, exactly.
And so that's down the tubes. And they're threatening to bomb Iran, and that could create World War III if that happens.
Yeah.
Iran is not Iraq. It's a huge country, 4 times the size of Iraq. And Iraq did not even have an air force when were bombing them, but Iran does, and they're allies of Russia. And so that's very dangerous, something to very worry about. It wouldn't be the first time our politicians created a catastrophe like that, like Woodrow Wilson did in the early 20th century. And so that's something to worry about. On the other hand, Trump has done a lot of good things. Crime control is a top priority of his. And Doge I'm glad Doge exists. I'm glad Elon Musk has done what he's done. It's been very educational. When Ron Paul was running for the Republican nomination, I've known Ron for 40 years. He spoke at the Mises Institute last summer at our Mises University, our week-long summer school for college students. And he said to us that, the main benefit of his efforts was to educate a lot of people about such things as the Fed and a lot of other things.
Right.
And I think Elon Musk and what he's doing is educating a lot of people.
Yep, I do too.
And it opened the eyes of a lot of people to see these outrageous examples he came up with of people supposedly 187 years old still collecting Social Security. And so a lot of people understood what a racket government is who weren't paying really any attention. But that's an eye opener there.
Oh, absolutely.
Everyone can relate to that.
Yeah.
That's thievery.
Well, it's been an absolute pleasure, Tom, to have you on the show and talk about this stuff. We've been talking to Dr. Thomas DiLorenzo, who, with the Mises Institute, they put out a documentary called Playing with Fire, Money, Banking, and the Federal Reserve. And you can find it at the Mises Institute. Is that the website?
Mises, right. Mises.org.
Okay.
Our website.
Yep. And I would.
Or it's on YouTube.
Yeah, and I would highly recommend you go out and spend 30 minutes of your time, 35 minutes of your time, and watch this documentary. It'll certainly open your eyes.
Came out in October, and it has almost 1 million views on YouTube now.
Wow, amazing. Well, sir, it's been an absolute pleasure, and I hope to have you back on again in the future.
Sure, my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks, Tom.
Take care.
You too.
Thank you for listening. If you would like to listen to more Clarity from Chaos shows on demand, go to clarityfromchaos.buzzsprout.com or send Dave an email at info@clarityfromchaos.com for information on previous shows. You can also listen to the show on Apple Podcast, Spotify, Twitter, or Google Podcast. Until next time, please remember, it's not about waiting for the storm to pass. It's about learning to dance in the rain. Be well, everyone.